So excuse me, everyone, for interrupting more delightful conversation. I want to introduce our speaker. The last session of our conference workshop. This person you know quite well now, if you didn't already, it's Von Tarikian. He's the Chief International Officer for the American Association for the Advancement of Science, AAAS. Von's also the director of the Center for Science Diplomacy at AAAS. We talked a lot about science diplomacy. Prior to joining AAAS, he served as Special Assistant to the Undersecretary of State for Democracy and Global Affairs, where he was an advisor on international science, technology, environment, and health issues, including clean energy and sustainable development, climate change, scientific outreach, avian influenza. He's a two-time recipient of the Department's Superior Honor Award for his work on climate change and avian flu. This afternoon, he'll give us a brief overview of what science diplomacy is and how scientists can help improve country-to-country relationships by doing what we do best, namely science. So please welcome Von Tarikian.
Thank you so much. Thank you to Neil. Thank you for listening to me at the end here. I'm reminded that of an old story that during the Roman times, the emperor, as part of his festivities, would have the events where they'd send the prisoners down to meet their death to the lions in the Colosseum. And so one day there was big festival and festivities in the Colosseum, and the prisoners were down there, and the lions were released, and the crowd and the audience was getting ready for blood, and they really liked it, and they watched it, and the lions were getting reared up, and suddenly, the slave or the prisoner was standing there nervously looking, and then he sort of had this look like he knew what he was doing, and he stopped as the lion was ready to come towards him and maul him, and he whispered something in the lion's ear. And the lion just fell down and just lied down and fell asleep. And the emperor was so upset. This is this festival he had planned, and he went and he was trying to figure out, how did this prisoner get away from this? Why did the lion not kill him? So he went down and he called the prisoner up, and he said to the prisoner, why, what did you say to that lion that made it not want to eat you and kill you? And he said, I warned the lion that after the meal come the speeches. So with this, I will start with my not a speech but a presentation. So again, as we mentioned, and I think as we were talking about this issue of science diplomacy, I think it's actually I thank sort of everyone for setting this talk up. I couldn't have imagined a better way to be set up is over the last day and a half of conversation that I hope this piece of it will actually be somewhat important and related to what we've been discussing. So I start out with this kind of comment because we use the word science and diplomacy in some order, and we think of it refers actually to a lot of things. And then, as our famous Shakespeare said, what's in a name? Well, in this case, a lot of things. How you put science and diplomacy in a sentence and where you place it actually in many ways defines what you're talking about. So there's this idea of science in diplomacy where there are global issues like climate change and infectious disease and other things, where the role of science in informing the diplomatic community on how to address foreign policy issues is very important. There's also the diplomacy for science, and there's a number of examples of that where countries have worked together in things like ITER and other things to get the diplomatic community to work closely to identify ways to push forward major science projects that the science community wanted. The one I'm going to focus on today is this issue of science, oops, keeps flashing in and out here, science for diplomacy and science diplomacy. And that really is based upon the utilization of science cooperation, international science cooperation, for building relationships. And that's really where on an international scale. And that's really where I'll focus my efforts. And like I said, it's the application of international science cooperation motivated by the desire to establish or enhance relationships between and among societies. Well, why science? And then I think, in this case, I prefaced my remarks earlier by saying this is going to be a very U.S.-focused presentation, though there are other examples that actually are very useful for other countries or other examples in history where science cooperation has been used in this way. But why is science a good way to think about building relationships and building international relationships? Well, almost by its definition, it's apolitical. It's something that can bring people together around to solve problems. And it does address and the issues of great importance to pretty much all societies, whether it's innovation policy, whether it's the development of new technologies, whether it's climate change. These are societally important issues that science addresses. It is based on a method. So this idea of transparency and peer review and meritocracy and data-driven research are all important for people to think about how to build, maybe societies that are built on these things as well. It gives us access, from us, in this case the US, and it has for its history to great ideas and great people as they've come to the United States either to study or to stay or just by reaching out. So it's always been a way of communicating. And there's a big piece of it which the foreign policy community has to think about, which is, and maybe I'll date myself a little bit with this, from Saturday Night Live, I'm good enough, I'm smart enough, and doggone it, people like me. Well, people do like scientists, and particularly U.S. scientists. And so if you look through polling around the world, this was done in 2004, really at the height, or I guess at the nadir of the U.S., the view that the U.S. held in the world, particularly in some strategically important places in the Middle East, that if you look at Morocco, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Lebanon, the United Arab Emirates, the favorability, the overall favorability towards the United States was, quite low, and the unfavorability quite high. And you can imagine, sort of the events that caused this, but it was actually something that was really creating a lot of problems. But in each case, the respect and admiration for U.S. science and scientists in each of these cases was significantly higher than the overall view of the United States. And they did this not only for science, so you look here at Morocco, 90% favorability towards U.S. science. Even in Saudi Arabia, where really 4% favorability, you wonder who those 4 people were that were paid off. 48% had a highly favorable view towards U.S. science and scientists, and so in each case it's above it. When they did these same numbers with U.S. culture, U.S. Disney, Coca-Cola, again, very low numbers. In each case, the respect and admiration for U.S. science and scientists was very high. And that's not just true in the Middle East. In fact, if you looked at Pew poll dating from, I think, 2 years ago, in 43 countries, the one exception being Russia, actually 2 exceptions, Russia and Israel, for reasons I can explain for Israel, not so much for Russia. But Pew polling data definitely demonstrated that the general view towards U.S. science and scientists was significantly greater than the overall view of the United States as a whole. For Israel, the reason why was because the general view of the United States was extremely high. Favorability towards the United States was extremely high, and the science was extremely high, but just a little bit lower than the overall. There's a great history in the United States for actually taking advantage of science cooperation as a way to build political bridges as well as scientific bridges. And I'll just very quickly go through 3 examples. And in fact, one could argue all 3 of these deal with the Asia-Pacific region, though 2 clearly do. The U.S.-Japan example is actually one of the most interesting and least noticed, or at least noted. The U.S.-China example is probably a little bit better understood, and then many people understand the former Soviet Union examples as science cooperation. So the history of science diplomacy with Japan is one where this is a picture of turned to be Ambassador Reichbauer, who was a foreign policy expert at Harvard's Kennedy, not the Kennedy School, sorry, the Harvard School of Foreign Policy. And he wrote a paper in a distinguished foreign affairs journal called Foreign Affairs, where he talked about the broken dialogue with Japan. And this was in the late 50s. And he said, the U.S. and Japan are not having any dialogue among their intellectual and academic communities. And this was a lot of concern for the U.S. policy community, the foreign policy community, because this was after the war, a little bit after the war, and while the relationships between the 2 governments was quite good, there was concern that the intellectual and academic communities were drifting further and further apart, and that would have an impact on society. And so he talked about this, the broken dialogue with Japan. Well, Reichbauer was actually an influential person in President Kennedy's life. And so when President Kennedy became president, went from being John F. Kennedy to President Kennedy, he ended up coming and asking Edwin Reichbauer to be his ambassador to Tokyo. And so when President Kennedy and Prime Minister Ikeda met for the first time in 1961 at the White House, he pushed hard and said, what can we do to develop these stronger connections? And one of the key ones was the scientific cooperation between Japan and the United States. And the National Science Foundation for the United States actually does that part of it, and for Japan, it's the Japanese Society for the Promotion of Science. And both sides, and this is why a lot of the conversations we had today, both sides agreed to put money into those programs where they would promise to look at ways to do collaborative research and fund it, and the NSF and JSPS would do the process, but it would be funded in this way to say, we're going to work together You guys, the science community, determine how and where and when and what to do. But the political impetus was international cooperation is going to take place bilaterally between these two countries. Well, at the time, the scientific community was probably up in arms, saying, hold on, we're the United States of America. My goodness, we're the biggest scientific power on the face of the earth. And in Japan, what did they have? They're just coming out of the Cold War, the World War II. They had most of their stuff decimated or taken away from them. Most of the stuff they were doing was little transistors in basements. There was not really this robust science community. What are we going to work on? Well, they found little things, and the little things became a little bigger things. And over time, one of the great examples is, just last year, I was actually in Japan when this happened, a great example of the success, not just the political success, but the scientific success of this kind of engagement, was you look in the US, 2 Japanese and 1 American Japanese shared a Nobel Prize in physics. Now, if that's not sort of the vindication or the validation that, yes, maybe from small little bits over time you get more cooperation, it's not just good for building relationships. In fact, ultimately, science gets better, more ideas are exchanged, and better things happen. Well, the history of science diplomacy with China is quite robust and rich. In fact, this year we're celebrating the 30th anniversary of the official U.S.-China Science and Technology Cooperation Agreement, which was signed actually in 1979, right when the official normalization took place. But in fact, this was a history of engagement that was actually part of the earliest engagement between President Nixon and China, when President Nixon went to China and asked Henry Kissinger to look for ways to better engage China, to move the relationship beyond the geopolitical and to something that could actually provide people-to-people contacts. Science cooperations and exchanges were a critical element of that piece. And the U.S.-Soviet Union example is one, again, I think many people know about because it was really at a time when there was there's very limited official relationships between the two countries. The scientific communities were able to work seamlessly, sometimes under difficult situations, sometimes facing some of the same issues that we talk about here, export controls and visa problems and difficulty finding the funding. But really, at the end of the day, the scientists coming together, working together, created very long-lasting connections. I know that my father was actually very early on in some of the early engagements with the Soviet Union, and those were relationships that maintained themselves even after the fall of the Soviet Union, when the Russian scientists were now Russian scientists looking for counterparts to work with as their economy was having problems, but they had built these relationships and this trust. There's some story that says that actually when Gorbachev came into power, one of the things he had around him were a lot of these scientists from the Soviet Union that had been part of these exchanges, and they were very close collaborators with him and very close friends. And he was able to ask out for their advice, and they would say to him, President Gorbachev, among other things, we've worked with the U.S. and the Westerners. They have very good science, and it might be better than ours. You've been reading a lot of stuff in your official briefings. It might not be true. They might be further ahead of us. And that Gorbachev took this very much and said, these are the types of things we need to encourage more interactions with the West because we can't survive if we don't have more of that. And there was some stories that have been sent down. But I mentioned earlier that this is going to be from the U.S. perspective, but it's not just a U.S. experience. That science as a way of engaging and building bridges is actually something that we've seen both in the past and presently. In Europe, after World War II, a lot of the bringing together, particularly of France and Italy and Germany after the war and this breakdown that had occurred in the horrific events of World War II, was actually the bridge between science and science exchanges and getting people moving throughout Europe and working together collaboratively was actually a lot of science. And in fact, now, when you see with the new sort of accession countries within the European Union, those countries, when they first come into the European Union, one of the first ways that they're able to engage with the European countries as they come in is through science cooperation. In fact, even Turkey right now has the one chapter that they've been able to close in their compact with the European Union has been on science cooperation, that they've been able to close things to actually encourage more scientific cooperation with the European Union as part of a broader effort to become integrated into Europe. And I use this example of Israel and Palestine. These are pretty intractable problems from a political standpoint, but the Israeli-Palestinian Scientific Organization has worked very hard over a long period of time to get Israelis and Palestinians to work together on issues of common interest and common benefit both in terms of commercialization, but also basic research and shared research, to work closely together, to build linkages and build bridges and build trust. And so, it's not just, like I said, a US thing. There's other examples. Well, the current context, I'm going to just go through 3 examples in the current context and then go through some of our own experiences at AAAS. This is a picture of then Undersecretary of State Paula Dobriansky, for whom I worked, and the Foreign Minister of Libya and the Science Minister of Libya signing a science and technology cooperation agreement at the State Department after the US and Libya actually agreed that Libya would give up its weapons of mass destruction, and the US would try to bring them in and bring them into the fold of relationship. One of the first things officially that happened was the Science and Technology Cooperation Agreement, to say, we want to build a relationship with you on something beyond just the geopolitics of the relationship. We want to actually build a closer relationship with Libya as part of a way to move forward a bilateral relationship that was going forward. This is an example here. I was actually part of this delegation, though it was actually a women leaders in science, technology, and engineering in the Arab world. And this is actually something where AAAS, my organization, provide the U.S. piece to it, where we identified some high-achieving female scientists from the United States and met with 22 Arab countries in Kuwait, women leaders, three from each of the Arab countries, including Iraq, 3 years ago. The Kuwaiti government paid for this, but the amazing thing was it was a way for women from varying levels of their careers to come together, to meet with counterparts in the United States, and just discuss not even fields of science, but just what it meant to be a scientist. And that dialogue was critical. You'd had the official relationships were going forward, the relationships between the countries and governments was going forward, but the problem that the United States often has with many parts of the Middle East is there's nothing in society-to-society links. And so one of the efforts through these types of activities was to build these society-to-society links, where you actually had U.S. women leaders in science meeting with their counterparts throughout the Arab world. Interestingly, when you talk to women during this conference, they said not only was it great to meet Americans, it was great to meet other Arab women, and that only through this type of activity of the U.S. and focusing on this kind of activity could you actually get the Arab women in the region to get together and find that they had a lot more common interests, common experiences. Many of them actually attended school in the United States together and didn't know about it. So that's the society piece. This one was actually one of the most interesting ones for me personally. We went to Syria about 3 weeks ago as part of a delegation, a science cooperation delegation. This is sort of the typical science cooperation type delegation. You sit around tables, but critically interesting for us was that we had the opportunity, after having dialogues with our Syrian counterparts about ways to cooperate, we actually sat down with President Assad for about an hour and a half. And he had no staff in the room, and he said, the first thing he says, I'm an ophthalmologist. I'm a scientist. I understand science cooperation. I understand the value of science in improving people's lives. This is a way that I think the United States and Syria can work much more closely together. And it is. There's so many geopolitical issues that need to be discussed, and they can be discussed from a geopolitical standpoint, but the ability to enter into the highest levels of conversation on issues of mutual interest, of mutual benefit, that are apolitical, are really quite valuable. So, we talked almost much of this conversation about barriers to science diplomacy. After this conversation, hearing from everybody here, I could add more to this, and I can actually update these slides. But, this issue of security, exports, and technologies, asymmetry in capabilities, the science community, like I mentioned, will sometimes say, well, why are we spending our money working with that country when we're the best? It is that example that Neil said of, if it's not invented here, it can't be any good. Well, I think we're seeing that that's beginning to shift more and more. Funding is obviously a big one to follow up, and organizations and priorities. Well, I get into a little bit of this conversation, and maybe this actually can lead to some of our recommendations, that the U.S. government actually is not well organized for science diplomacy. Technical agencies, rightfully, are focused on their mission research, so their specific mission, whether it's energy or environment or whatever it is. And the State Department, I think, as it was noted, does not actually have the capacity to do science cooperation per se. It's got some scientists, but not a lot. So, I've thought that we should be creating ambassadors in the State Department, as we mentioned, to actually do more stuff. That money can come through as a diplomatic priority. Don't not only make it a science priority like we've discussed, but actually think about, if you think of science as a valuable way of promoting diplomacy, then money actually could go to the State Department but not stay there. It can go to the State Department to identify countries like Japan in the 40 years ago. That then says, well, let's find 10 countries where science cooperation is valuable, and then let NSF, again, run the process to encourage cooperation. You can better coordinate and publicize what you're doing. But then this gets to this issue that Chris was mentioning. Think public diplomacy. And I don't know if anybody watched the movie or watched the TV show The Nanny with Fran Drescher. Well, this is Fran Drescher, the nanny, and she's at the State Department being codified as an official special envoy for the United States in public diplomacy. And people, enjoy that. And it's a lot of athletes and entertainers that are given this status. And as much as people love the nanny, people really in other countries love U.S. science and scientists, as I mentioned before. And this is Joe Taylor, who's a Nobel Prize winner from Stanford. And he's giving a speech at Sharif University in Tehran. And it's hard to tell but it's an overflowing room from the accounts of people that were there. They were filling up into the hallway to watch it on TV. They wanted to see an American Nobel Prize winner talk about his scientific research. And it's a young crowd interested in this, and they're very interested in what he's talking about. Well, the follow-up to this is that after he left, they started building a statue for him in recognition of his visit. We cannot forget in the public diplomacy world that as much as we value in the United States our entertainers and our athletes, much of the world values about us our science and technology, our ability to get to the moon, our ability to find things. And that's a place of common discussion and value, and it's important. And so we created a AAAS, and I won't go through this too long, but we created a AAAS, the Center for Science Diplomacy, which works very closely to provide a forum for the policy community, the foreign policy community, and policy analysts in the science community to talk about ways to promote science diplomacy. And we analyze what's going on, we characterize major barriers like we've been doing today, and we leverage existing partnerships and try to find new partnerships to promote science diplomacy, not only as an official government activity, but in fact civil society doing it, because that actually is where you can get sustainability. And so I think our goals are we're inspiring, right? We have meetings, we attend meetings, we talk about things. We make the policy community. So a lot of the conversations we have here are very helpful because then when we do things with the policy community in Washington, we can raise the profile of international science cooperation through activities and meetings. And we've done them on Iran, and we've done them on Libya, and we've done them on Syria, and we're going to do them in other places as well. We just did a program on the 30th anniversary of U.S.-China cooperation in science. Operational, which is actually going and putting together delegations to go places and to promote research. And intellectual, which is figuring out exactly what the hell we mean when we're talking about this stuff and getting people to think about it. And so we've done, I won't go too much into this, but we've done a lot of conferences on this activity, and we've actually brought in Congressman Baird, who was the co-chair of a committee that was very influential in the science community on the Hill, was there. But critically, we also had somebody from the Foreign Relations Committee come and talk about the role of science in that cooperation. So we've had, again, this is the pieces, and this is a good place as any to end. We had a high-level visit to Syria. We're planning a visit to North Korea to think about ways that science cooperation might encourage more bilateral exchanges, even while the political situation goes back and forth. We have a lot with Iran, and we were supposed to go to Cuba 2 weeks ago, but that trip got postponed until later. I'll end with two quotes, which I think are actually pretty useful here, considering the context we're in. And one of them is, in this wither science diplomacy, Secretary Clinton on one of her first days in office held a town hall and was asked, what do you think about science in the State Department? And I'll just say, enlisting scientists for all kinds of the problems that we face, working to encourage more scientific exchanges, creating once again what was historically an American strength, our higher education system, our research institutions, the science history that is so rich. And so she says this to lay it up. And then on January 20th, this past year of 2009, President Obama in paragraph 16 says, we will restore science to its rightful place. And when we think about science diplomacy, he says in paragraph 24, we will extend a hand if you are willing to unclench your fist to countries of the world. And I've often thought that science diplomacy is actually the merging in some ways of these things with some of the countries where the U.S. does not have very good relations. But in fact, through science and an unclenched fist, you can actually promote science diplomacy. So with that, I'll take as many questions or comments as one might have, but more importantly, I thank you all because these slides will now be updated. It's actually new material to put into it. So thank you.
Thank you, Bob.
Sure. Yeah. Go ahead, or comments if this is something meaningless. I think the sugar coma is about to kick in, right?
You briefly talked about what you're doing at the center, but I was just actually wondering what specifics. Are you just doing outreach programs? You're just doing conferences and trying to talk with the community? Are you disseminating anything? And you also mentioned closed sessions, and I was just kind of curious what that.
So the closed session, you were involved, actually. Krista was involved in the session that we had in October, where we were talking about the different ways in which science could be used in a diplomatic context. The next day, what we had, we will at AAAS, one of the nice things is we can actually have closed sessions because we're not government funded. We are our own funded or funded through foundation money. So we had a series of closed sessions with some senior policymakers, both congressmen and senior State Department people, to talk about the barriers to science cooperation internationally, to talk about what direction we should be thinking about going with science diplomacy. And so that was the closed session. I've published a little bit on science diplomacy. We're actually going to bring somebody on to help define what science diplomacy actually looks like and what it means. Even getting to that piece of all the different types of diplomacies that science diplomacy is involved with is based on trying to develop some sort of a method of coding what all this means, and because the community thinks about it in 10 different ways, and sort of providing some sort of a tag for each one of the things is actually one of the things we're pushing forward on. Yeah.
Yeah, I have a question about, I don't know if you're familiar with David Sandilow and Kenneth Lieberthal have a report on trying to get the United States and China to work together on environmental issues and kind of energy demand management. But one of the things that they mentioned there, which unfortunately they don't really go into, was talking about creating an Asia Corps, a transnational corps of young people, since we have a lot of, particularly in an economic downturn, you have a lot of people coming out of universities who don't necessarily have the jobs, to go out there right now anyway, but then they have an interest in solving some of these global problems. And at the same time, within the U.S., we're ramping up the AmeriCorps, maybe I think increasing threefold, the number of people who are going to be involved in that. So maybe there's the idea that perhaps if you had something like a transnational version, getting the next generation to work together, do you see any tie-in with science diplomacy?
Absolutely. And this is, I think, one of the great potential areas, in part because universities aren't hiring young people right now. So the way to think about it is, Harold Varmus, who is now one of the co-chairs of the President's Committee of Advisors on Science Technology, he's very interested in this idea of how do you get the Millennium Science Initiative, how do you actually get more U.S. scientists engaged internationally as part of a way of not only helping to build capacity, but actually build relationships. And he actually did a whole series of interviews on this while in the UK. But there's another level, which is how do you get the just graduated or just about to graduate graduate students. Our session on Working Group 5 today, or Group 5, had this conversation of how do you actually begin to take advantage of the fact that a lot of the newly graduating students, both with PhDs and masters, are very interested in doing much more stuff internationally. Are there mechanisms to deal with some of the big issues? And this type of activity, and David and I had talked about this at one point, that how do you actually get the policy community and the funding community to come together and say, this is not only something that is good for people exchanges, but is actually critically valuable for maybe addressing some of the problems that have been there for now decades and actually could use a whole new set of eyes to maybe solve. So it is an area where I think there will be more activity. And potentially a way to get people, particularly people that dedicate a lot of time to getting their PhDs, some sort of employment, if nothing else, over the near term.
What's current attitude within our State Department, and what's the trend line sort of getting significant funding for the necessary activities? Because a lot could be done through the State Department, obviously, and you've spoken to that. Where do you see us, and what is maybe the role of the science advisor to the Secretary in the issues you're talking about?
Absolutely. So there's a science advisor to the Secretary of State, which is a relatively new position, but it's very important that she right now is a senior scientist, and that's actually very valuable to have somebody who is from the scientific community that's able to advise the Secretary of State on issues of science and technology. So not only the way that science technology impacts some of the foreign policy issues like climate change or food production, but critically this issue of trying to encourage and use the position of science advisor as a bully pulpit with the Secretary of State to encourage these types of things. And I've spoken to Nina Fedorov, who's the current science advisor, and she's very interested in this issue of science diplomacy. I would say that the policy community, at least in certain places, is very interested. Senator Lugar, who is a fairly senior member of the U.S. Senate and is also the ranking member on the Foreign Relations Committee, just introduced legislation last week that actually called on the Secretary of State to create a new positions of science envoys. What we're talking about here, what we're talking about in some ways, to actually take advantage of the fact that bringing scientists that are not employees of the government, but identifying them, paying their way to go overseas and to just engage with the world as representatives of the U.S. government, though not necessarily representatives of the U.S. government positions, is a very valuable public diplomacy mechanism. So you have very senior people in the foreign policy arena thinking about taking advantage of this. Again, Congressman Berman, who's in charge, who's the chair of the House Foreign Relations Committee, is working on legislation reauthorizing the State Department. And in it, there will be likely some statement about how the U.S. scientific community can interact more with the foreign policy community to help engage the world more robustly. So I think there's a lot of different motions. It takes constant follow-up and constant activities because it's not an obvious place. This is not the emergency of the day. But every emergency of the day has underpinning it science and technology. You cannot talk about swine flu without talking about the fact that we have in the room an expert on infectious disease who could talk in virology, who could be talking with counterparts in the United States about ways to maybe monitor and keep track of this and to find vaccines. You cannot talk about climate change by just monitoring and having scientists work in New England. You've got to have the whole view and interacting. You cannot talk about innovation without taking advantage of all the different ways. And again, it is the easiest choir to sing in front of, right? But that's the message that we send out over and over again. And I think more than not, the policy community in Washington is hearing it. I mean, your own efforts when you were a science advisor to the president, you raised the profile of science to the president. I mean, you don't get much higher than that, and those types of efforts are needed, and there's an entire community behind those efforts that's willing and able to hopefully speak out with some amount on that. Yeah.
I'm from AFSR. Actually, I just want to share with what we have with you on science diplomacy. We do have programs similar like you described. Yesterday, Dr. A.G. mentioned about AFSR program. We have actually 3 offices, one in Tokyo and the other in London, and the South America is coming up soon. But there, we kind of dispatch scientists as an interface between the regional scientific community and the U.S. scientific community. So we've been already working in a way as a science diplomat. In London's case, about 50 years, and in Asia, Tokyo office case, about almost 20 years. So I share with you about what you're describing about how important that interaction in the scientific community to develop better relationship with the different nations. So I just want to share with you that we have actually a program, and if you want to know more about it, please let me know.
Please, absolutely no. I mean, the point that we've been trying to make to the policy community is this is not something that's new. That scientists have been doing this. Scientists have been doing this almost from the beginning of science, where they've been working across borders and building relationships and thinking about this. Now, it's very important for the policy community to think in terms of and take advantage of the fact that these are really great ways and proven ways of not only building the links, but more important than ever, solving the problems that are inherently global and increasingly global in nature and require global cooperation. And that you can almost look at any continent or any region, and scientists have been working together on these issues to try to not only build trust, but actually build knowledge. And every way that these things have been going forward now, we just keep emphasizing over and over again. So thank you. Yeah, I would be very interested. Yeah, thank you. No, thank you so much.
Thank you very much. So thank you very much, Vaughn. That was a wonderful way to really encapsulate much of what we talked about, but also challenge us with this very important goal. And I think we'll all have to work together to accomplish it. As I said earlier, you're all guinea pigs. We invited you here for this experiment. Dashwan said this workshop was a success before it started. He didn't say it was a success after it started. So at least from my perspective, your performance has been absolutely outstanding. I want to thank all of you for your time and attention, and especially those of you who came from large distances. I want to thank our co-organizers here who did a great job working with us. We will follow up soon. I want to thank Dr. Kirsten Matthews, who put all this together, and our Melissa, I think, is not in the room, but we will thank her on your behalf. She was terrific to help us, and our tech people keeping us out of trouble. We create a few little technical glitches just to see whether you're all awake and paying attention, and we continue to improve our system, I think. So are there any logistic issues? I think the bus arrives at 2. Is that correct, or it's already there? Sorry? 1:45. At 1:45. So you have time to take a brief rest or whatever and say your goodbyes. Let us know if you need anything before you leave here, if you need phone calls, anything else we can help you with. And we will be back in touch. Thank you all very much.